All right, so I realize this is going to be kind of an involved question. Might be more than you can answer right now. But recently, a lot of atheists have had issues with the Noah account as to regards to the fossil records and why there's not some kind of evidence that there was a worldwide flood. And it's actually an interest to me personally, and I understand it's a fairly large question. What do you make of that?
Sure, great question having to do with the flood. You know, the Bible does describe in Genesis 6 through 8 a worldwide flood. Where I'm coming from, I've always believed the Bible, so when I read that account, in the Bible it describes it as historical narrative, meaning it's saying this happened, versus poetry when it says God covers us, protects us with his wings. The Bible's not trying to tell us God has wings. The Bible tells us that God is a spirit, he's not a physical being, and the Psalms were written as poetry. So anytime you guys read a book, you always read it within its context. You don't just flip it open and automatically assume everything is literal. Or when a friend writes you a letter, they say, I worked like a dog last night. You don't think, you know the context. So same thing with the Bible. I don't take it literally, I take it contextually. Genesis is literal history. Genesis 6 through 8, the flood, literal history. It says that actually happened. Now it's easy to make fun of the story there. Oh yeah, God flooded the earth and put all those animals on the ark, and there's no way you could fit, all these millions of species on the ark. Well, the Bible doesn't say that anyway. It says 2 of each kind and all that. But just trying to answer this a little shorter, the Bible does describe a flood. Is there anything in the physical world that would seem to confirm or be consistent with that? And I think there's a lot of physical evidence. One of the world's leading geologists, Dr. Steve Austin, he's done a lot of research on Mount St. Helens. I just Skyped with him yesterday. He's also on the board of Logos Research Associates with myself. Brilliant guy. He could go on for years and years with all this stuff. And then Dr. John Baumgartner, PhD geophysicist, and we were Skyping yesterday as we're on the same board. Just brilliant guy. He's built the world's best 3D computer simulation of plate tectonics. Just off the charts, brilliant guy. But let's just go over some of these things. If there was a worldwide flood, that's a prediction, that's a model. The Bible says there was a worldwide flood. What would we expect to see if there was a worldwide flood? If there was a worldwide flood, we would expect to see layers laid down all over the earth by water, these sedimentary layers laid down by water. We would expect them to be deposited rapidly through a cataclysmic flood. We'd expect them to be filled with fossils. What do we actually see? We see layers all over the planet, sedimentary layers that were obviously laid down by water, and that they were laid down catastrophically because of the fossils in them. Here's another point about those fossils. Bill Nye made a comment last night, how come we don't see fossils of kangaroos, hopping from the ark down to Australia and all this stuff? And people laughed, I'm sure, it made it sound very silly, but he obviously doesn't understand geology or the biblical account of the flood. The way you get a fossil is to bury something rapidly, catastrophically. If a cow dies in the field today, falls over, other animals come and they eat the meat, and then the bones themselves will deteriorate over a short period of time. In the future, you won't even know there was a cow there. Be totally gone, disintegrated. Now, if that cow got covered, buried by a landslide very quickly, it can be preserved from the Earth's atmosphere, and oxygen specifically, and that it could fossilize over time. So in order to fossilize something, you have to bury it rapidly. Well, now we look at all these layers in the earth, and they are literally filled with billions and billions and billions of fossils. That means that those layers must have been laid down catastrophically in a short period of time. If they accumulated slowly over millions of years, you wouldn't get those fossils in them. Also, we have fossils that go up through multiple layers. They're called polystrate fossils. And I have pictures in my other talks of a polystrate fossil tree going up through multiple layers. The story, according to evolutionists, would have to be, well, this bottom layer where you see it rooted, let's say 200 million years ago, the tree was growing in that layer. And then that tree stood there for millions of years as it's waiting for the other layers to eventually bury it. That's physically impossible. The tree would have rotted away long before those other layers got there. Also, when we look at these polystrate fossils, they're missing something very crucial. We like to call them root systems. There's no root systems there. These trees weren't growing there. They were growing somewhere else, rapidly, catastrophically torn away from their root systems and rapidly redeposited in these layers in a short period of time in a single event. Sometimes we find these trees laying sideways or even upside down. They weren't growing there. And when Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980, it laid down hundreds of feet of layers in hours and days. It did take hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. It took one relatively small volcano, a very short period of time. And what we saw connected with that, we saw all these layers with these tree stumps and things in these layers at different levels that formed in a short period of time when they were floating in Spirit Lake, and then they would eventually become waterlogged, and they go vertical, and then they would sink to the bottom, and whatever layer of peat was forming from the bark and all that drifting down to the bottom, they would get rooted in that, and then more layers would come down from the surface, and then another tree would sink down in that layer. So you'd have these multiple trees and multiple layers, just like we see at Yellowstone National Park, where they say, oh, it's hundreds of thousands of years it took. No, we saw in a laboratory, in a sense, in Mount St. Helens. It happened in a short period of time by one volcano. So there's a lot of evidence for a worldwide flood happening. We have fossils of sea creatures on top of Mount Everest. How do you get sea creatures fossilized on top of Mount Everest? Unless Mount Everest was lower in the past and was covered with water.
So, you use the analogy of the English language or the human language to describe how random mutations would cause the messages to become meaningless. Do we know if that is the case in the genetic language as well, or does that only apply to, you see what I'm asking?
Sure, it does apply not only to English language, but to the genetic code, because the genetic code is a digital code. It's like the computer languages, it's kind of a digital code in genetics too. And what we see is when you've got genes that code for something, when you make random changes, it destroys that function. It won't produce the protein folding the right way. They will talk about every once in a while, but some of these mutations are good. And that's what evolution kind of selects out. Natural selection keeps those good ones. And I would say that every once in a great while there is a mutation that they could call a positive mutation, a beneficial mutation. But let me give you a quick example. And this is another example of how something at first sounds pretty good, but then you look at the rest of the story like, oh, okay, it doesn't count. How many of you have heard of antibiotic resistance? Bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. Everyone hears about that. It's used as proof of evolution. Here's how the story goes. Little girl gets sick. The doctor tests her out. Oh, yeah, you got this bad bacteria. All the bacteria in your body, a lot of it's good, some of it's bad. So they test her out. You got this bad strain of bacteria here, but that's okay. We have created an antibiotic to get rid of that bacteria. So they give her a shot, and then she goes home, and she starts feeling a lot better. But then, it doesn't take too long. She starts getting sick again. And it's like, wow, we thought we had to take care of her. She's sick again. Let's take her back to the doctor. She goes back to the doctor and says, oh, yeah, we still got the bacteria. We'll give you another shot. Give her another shot of antibiotic. Goes home. She's not feeling better. Parents are surprised. Take her back to the doctor the third time. The doctor does some testing. He looks at the bacteria in the laboratory with the microscope and says, your bacteria have evolved resistance to our antibiotic. We got to give you a different one now to take care of the new mutant bacteria. And so they give her a different shot and maybe she's okay. So here's the point. These bacteria have mutated and evolved resistance to the antibiotic in a pretty short period of time. If that much change can happen in a short period of time, imagine what could happen over millions and millions of years. It makes perfect sense. Until you look at the rest of the story. Here's how antibiotics typically work. We create an antibiotic that when you inject it into your body, these cells, these bacteria that are bad, see it as food coming at them. So they absorb it through their cell wall, and they create an enzyme to break it apart, kind of chew it. Well, when they break it apart with this enzyme, it converts it into a poison, and they kill themselves. So they die. They don't know what's going to happen, but that's what happens when they eat the antibiotic. So now you've got someone who's got all this bad bacteria, that these bacteria are reproducing, copying themselves over and over and over, you have millions and millions and millions of them. Well, some of them, when they're reproducing, are making mistakes in their DNA. Some of them, when they reproduce, destroy the information that makes the enzyme that's going to break the antibiotic down. So now the antibiotic's coming in, it's killing off the normal bad bacteria, but the mutant bad bacteria, they bring it into their cell wall, but they don't have the enzyme to break it apart. So it doesn't get converted into a poison. So they survive. Now what's interesting is, did those bacteria become resistant to the antibiotic? Yes, they did. Did they do that through change? Yes, they did. But the change happened by a loss of genetic information. They no longer have the genetic information to make the enzyme to break apart their food. They're not as healthy as normal bacteria. And they will be outcompeted by normal bacteria in the wild. They have an advantage in an environment where the antibiotic is around, but without that, they're dead. They're
not going to be able to compete because they're not as healthy, and they're going downhill. They've lost genetic information, they will never get that back again. So did they change? Yes. Did they become resistant? Yes, but they became resistant through the loss of genetic information. So would that produce a single cell into a human being? No, you're losing information. The more you do that, the worse it gets. So you can occasionally see some changes that seem to infer a benefit in the particular environment, but it's not helping evolution over millions of years. I'll give you one crude analogy. If I had some really bizarre accident in which I lost my arms and my legs, I could survive. People do. You could survive without your arms and legs. It doesn't mean your arms and legs aren't useful. It just means you can manage to survive without them. Let's say that happens to me. Let's say our country reinstitutes the draft. So they come to my house and knock on the door. They open it and they say, we want to draft you in the Army. And they oh, sorry, that's okay. You don't need to go. Well, if I didn't want to fight in the Army, which of course they wouldn't have a problem doing that, but if I didn't want to, that would be a benefit to me. Great, I don't have to go. Did losing my arms and legs, is that really a benefit to me in the big picture? No, I'm getting worse and worse. It just happened in that particular scenario. It was an advantage. So that's what we see. We see mutations are generally bad, even the ones that they call good. Might give them an advantage in a certain environment, but they're losing genetic information. Mutations are not known to create new information. And here's one other quick story with that. It's very, very important. The book that I mentioned, Genetic Entropy by Dr. John Sanford from Cornell, he makes a very, very powerful point in this about mutations. Mutations are known to be bad, and evolutionists say, yeah, the vast majority of them are bad. But they say, but they're only slightly bad. Most mutations are only slightly bad. A few of them just are horrendously bad and just kill the thing right away. They said, most of them are only just slightly negative. That's actually a problem. And here's why. Because it's just a slight change, it's only slightly bad, natural selection, in a sense, doesn't see it, doesn't even know that that creature had that change because it doesn't affect its ability to reproduce. So now the creature reproduces and it takes that slightly bad mutation with it. And then it reproduces and adds some more slightly bad mutations. And those don't go away either because it didn't affect its ability to reproduce. So it keeps accumulating these mutations. In fact, they figure that each time we reproduce, we're adding maybe up to 300 mistakes in our DNA each time humans reproduce. So my parents had all their mutations. It's called the genetic load. They had all their problems. When they had me, they added 300 more mistakes. I took their mistakes and the 300 new ones and added 300 more new ones to my kids. And it just keeps accumulating. One evolution said it's amazing we're not dead 100 times over. If we've been evolving 6 to 10 million years from an ape-like creature, all these things are accumulating. They're like rust spots on a car. One rust spot doesn't kill anything, doesn't hurt anything at all. Two doesn't hurt anything, 3 doesn't hurt anything. But eventually they accumulate and the quarter panel falls off the car. That's what mutations are like. So even if once in a great while you have a positive one, it's not creating new information, and you've got massive amounts of these slightly deleterious ones that accumulate, which lead to the demise of creatures. So there's tons more we can say about that, but I just wanted to throw that into it. Another question?
Considering that there are, I'm going to talk about old Earth and new Earth for a minute, and before you answer the question, I'm probably going to find that. But considering there are well-known theologians and pastors that many of us respect and follow, who, like Tim Keller and John Piper, who believe in old Earth, and there are other ones that believe in new Earth, do you think there's room in the discussion for in the Christian community for beliefs in both of those positions? And if so, I'm curious to see what your position is.
Sure. Great question. The age of the Earth, in a nutshell, is a can of worms. I wish I had a few hours to do it justice. I'll give you just a tiny bit of background and I'll answer your question. I think there's not only room for discussion, I think there ought to be discussion. That doesn't mean I don't have an opinion and feel a certain way, but if we don't even discuss something, then you never get to hear why someone else believes what they believe, and the people who do believe what they believe on the other side, the only one that's being discussed, they may not even understand thoroughly why they believe what they believe. They've never been challenged about it. So I think it's great to discuss things. And I have a lot of respect for other theologians and scientists who are Christians who believe differently than me. I tell you where I'm coming from. I've been studying and researching for 28 years. I have degrees in physics and engineering, so that actually means I'm right about everything. I say that humorously. No, all that means is I one skit that I remember seeing is they had this news program where this is going to be that funny to you guys that just like telling the story. They had this very professional news story. The newscaster interviewed some big, really important issue. They said, today, in tonight's program, we have Professor so-and-so from Wittenberg University. He's got 3 PhDs, whatever. Professor, you've been studying and researching this issue for 35 years. What do you think? I think it's too early to tell. You know, and they just went on to something else because that's what the show was, just kind of random. And I just thought, I've been studying for 35 years, and he says it's too early to tell. So after 28 years of me researching this, I better have an opinion. Doesn't prove I'm right, just means I have an opinion. I personally believe that God actually created everything in 6 days, the way it's described in Genesis. Number one, because that's what the Bible describes it. It says it very literally, historically. But then when I've actually looked at science, I see an awful lot that backs that up. And I know what the arguments are for an old universe, the Big Bang, and all the radiometric dating. We go on for hours about that. But I also know all the problems with that. Many people aren't as familiar with the problem. Usually the theologians aren't familiar with the problems with radiometric dating. They just have heard that there are scientists out there who are Christians who accept the old ages and it's good enough for them. But where I'm coming from, I see huge problems, not only scientifically, but biblically, because what happens is, you got the debate. You got the secular scientists who obviously believe in the Big Bang, billions of years for the universe. And then you've got some Christians who say, no, the Bible says 6 days, and it only gives an account of a number of thousands of years. And then you've got the majority of the people in the middle saying, I don't know what you guys are arguing about. I do believe in God, but I believe he used the Big Bang. End of story, case closed. That settles it. Why are you arguing about it? And it sounds like a great solution. But it actually causes more problems than it solves. It doesn't really solve anything. And I'm not going to go into the whole lecture in the book that I wrote, which I've been told by some of the leading creation scientists that it's probably the best overview of the creation evolution controversy that's out there. I have 3 chapters on the age of the earth. Not because I think it's the most important issue, it's not. I think the gospel message of Jesus Christ is by far more important than anything else. But if you take the gospel message seriously, you back in and take the Genesis seriously too. The reading will tell you just a second. But I have 3 chapters in there. One chapter is, why are we even talking about this? Because a lot of people say, you're just being divisive, it doesn't even matter why talk about it. So I have one chapter, why we're talking about it. Second chapter is, what does the Bible actually say? Seriously, when you look at it, what does it actually teach? And thirdly, what does science say? Is there anything from science that would kind of give us a feeling whether the Bible is really taken that way or not? So I go through all that in a lot of detail, which I'm not going to bring up right now because of time. But I'll comment very briefly, biblically and scientifically. Biblically, the Bible is very clear. The big picture is that God created everything to begin with, it was perfect. But Adam and Eve here, he gave them a choice. He didn't create them as robots and say, oh, praise you, God, you're the best, because you can't have a relationship with a robot. Of course you're praising me, I programmed you, they had a choice. He wanted to have a relationship with them, so he gave them a choice. If you praise me, it will mean something to me. I can have a relationship with you, but I have to give you a choice. I can't force you to love me. So he created Adam and Eve that way, gave them a choice, and we know what happened. They chose to do their own thing, they disobeyed God. So God had to separate himself from them because of their sin and disobedience. It was their decision, but he let them do that. He could have just squashed them and started over, but he loved them so much and said, you know what, I don't want it to end that way. I've got a plan. It's going to cost me the life of my own son. He's going to pay your price, but that's how much I love you. I'm going to do that. It's the whole story of the Old Testament building up to the arrival of Jesus Christ, his death, burial, and resurrection to pay for our sins. That's the whole story. Why did Jesus come and die on the cross? Because Adam and Eve sinned, and what happened there? The Bible tells us that brought death and a curse into God's perfect creation. That's what the Bible teaches. That's what the gospel message is all about. If we as Christians say, well, I believe that God used the Big Bang because the astrophysicists are so smart and they proved the Big Bang, who would be arguing? If God did that, and certainly it's powerful enough to do that, if he had done that, that means the Earth is probably 4.6 billion years old. That means the layers of the Earth formed over hundreds of millions of years. And these layers, as I mentioned, are filled literally with billions and billions of fossils. What's a fossil? Fossils are remain of a dead thing. So if God formed the Earth over billions of years, as these layers were forming, these creatures were living and dying and eating each other, and there's death, mutation, and suffering, survival of the fittest, mutations, tumors, and dinosaur bones, all that's going on, all this ugly, nasty stuff going on for millions of years. Then when the Earth is finally done, God plants a garden on top of all of it, puts Adam and Eve there, and they're saying, oh, this is such a perfect world. No, it's literally filled with death and disease and suffering and bloodshed and mutations and cancer and tumors. So when Adam then sinned and disobeyed God, that didn't bring death into God's world. That's been around for millions and millions of years. It's not Adam's fault. If it's not Adam's fault that death is in God's world, then Jesus Christ wasted his time dying for our sins. It's just not our fault. God used that process. That's just one reason why I don't think that that's a good solution to put that into Scripture. Scientifically, as was mentioned in the debate last night, which we can only cover so much, but science can't tell you the age of the Earth, because every method that science has today is based on assumptions. What science does is they look at radiometric dating. They can see uranium-238 decaying into lead-206. They can see it in the laboratory. They measure it over and over and over. They know the half-life is about 4.5 billion years. It would take, if you watched it today, it would take 4.5 billion years for it to decay from this much to half as much. That's the half-life. That's great science. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But to say that the Earth is old because of the process they see today requires assumptions. They have to assume that when the rock formed to begin with, it just had uranium in it. What if when it formed, it had a lot of lead in it? You'd say, wow, this thing is really old. It would take a long time for that lead to get there, to decay that slow. Well, it was there right away. They also have to assume that as the rock was there, no lead from the outside went in there to throw the dating off, and no lead that decayed leaked out somehow to throw the dating off. There's no way of knowing that. What was the history of this rock for 2 billion years? And they also have to assume that the decay rate we see today, it's always been at that rate. You can assume that if you want, but you don't know that because it happened in the past. So every single possible method we have involves those assumptions. I think many of those assumptions aren't so good, but what we say is, fine, let's just say, for instance, we'll give you that benefit of the doubt and say all those things are true, all those assumptions are true. 90% of the methods, over 90% of the methods that we have out there, if you use those assumptions, they contradict the billions of years. They come up with ages way, way too short. Thousands of years, just a couple million years. But they're looking for 15 billion years for the universe and 4.6 per year. So most of the methods contradict what they want to do. They handpick the ones they want, and they publish those, and there's a lot more they can say about that. But science hasn't proven anything. We just use processes, make assumptions, and try to create a clock out of it. And when you do that, the majority of it actually backs up things that are much younger than what they want to say for the age of the universe. But there's tons more to that. Don't get hung up on that. Anyone here tonight, don't get hung up on the age of the earth. Don't want to reject the Bible because of the age of the earth or anything. Focus more on Jesus, the gospel message and all that, and get a little bit further with that, get a little bit stable, and you can back into some of these things like the age of the earth or some other details about the flood or whatever. But don't get hung up on all those other things because the most important message is the gospel message of Jesus Christ. I don't mind talking about the age of the earth, but I don't want anyone here to think that that's all I care about. One of those crazy people who reject science because I view the earth as relatively young. If I had time, I could defend it very well, but we don't have time tonight, and it's not the most important thing. But I'm glad you covered it.
We have time for one more question here, if anyone has one. Just a quick question. That 78% of the world is, the United States is believed to be Christians, but the number of evolution I think recently was like something like 47% believe in evolution. Could you talk about the numbers? I'm not sure. Some TV shows where you'll see some people that will say you don't believe in evolution as though it's not the norm or the unacceptable thing of the United States culture. But if we're a Judeo-Christian country, how is that possible? If you can explain it.
Sure. Very interesting. There are different statistics that are used as far as how many people believe in creation or evolution and how many Christians are in this country. This is just my personal opinion. I think there are a lot less true Christians in this country than are thrown around in some of the numbers because a lot of people think, hey, I'm an American and I believe in God, I'm a Christian. Or they'll say, I believe in the Bible, so I'm a Christian. But a lot of these people don't know much at all about the Bible. I think they're probably sincere, but they really don't even understand what true Christianity is about. Many of them are still living their lives trying to be a good person. If you ask them, how are you going to get to heaven? I'm going to get to heaven because I believe in God and Jesus, and I work hard, and I'm a good person. I don't steal, and I go to church pretty often. I don't always make it because God knows I'm busy, and I do this and I do that, and I'm a good father and a good husband, and all these things. So all that together, God will let me into heaven. That's not what the Bible teaches. So they obviously don't understand what Scripture is actually teaching. The Bible is very clear. There's nothing we can do to earn our salvation. It can't be good enough. God's standard is 100% perfection. That looks pretty bad for us. Like, how does that work then? It works because Jesus Christ, the 100% perfect example, paid the price so that anyone who says, I accept that free payment for my sins, can have their sins forgiven and get to heaven. So the amount of people in this country that are truly biblical Christians is probably smaller than we think. So when they survey Christians, they're probably getting a lot of people who maybe aren't very consistent with what the Bible teaches. And then you probably have true Christians that maybe still aren't necessarily living as consistent as they should. I don't struggle with hypocrisy. It's one of the easiest things I do. It's so easy to say you believe one thing and then maybe have your life not match up. I did a great job growing up avoiding a lot of things. I didn't drink, smoke, go to bad movies. I didn't swear. In fact, I turned 40-10 last year. That's 50 in COVID. So I have not had a single drink of alcohol in my life. Now, I used to naively think when I was younger that maybe a little bit better somehow than whomever, but I realize now, no, it isn't better than anybody. It's just kind of a weird fact. And now I'm not going to have a beer because I don't want to ruin my record. It wouldn't be wrong for me to have one. I don't want to ruin my record. Made it this far and I have one just anyway. I've actually never sworn in my life. It's not because I'm such a good person. I just didn't really grow up with it. It's not part of my vocabulary. I've never smoked anything, never tried any drugs. I was a good kid, all on the outside, a little squeaky clean. But I struggled inside my mind as much as anyone else on the planet. So God wasn't too impressed with me. I thought he probably was because I was such a, I didn't do this, I didn't do that. I wasn't any better in incidents. I wasn't better than anyone else. I'm still a sinner. I still needed to have my sins forgiven. So I don't want to go off on a tangent with that, but with getting back to your question, what's interesting is that evolutionists are pretty upset with the low percentage of people who really believe in evolution in this country. They think, what are we doing wrong? We're only teaching it in the public school systems. That's the only view we're teaching. We're doing it in the universities. Yet why are they not believing it? I personally think it's because people know inside internally, they just know it doesn't make sense. I don't think that I'm an ape, an evolved ape-like creature. I just don't see it that way. It just doesn't sit right with me. Now, some people do. But if I go back to Scripture, which I always start there, God tells us in Romans chapter 1 that he himself has placed the knowledge of himself in every single human being, meaning that every single human being knows that God exists. It goes on to say, some people have chosen to reject this knowledge. I'm talking about this in more detail on the February 18th in Berlin with the advertisement that I have here if you're interested. But it's a fascinating talk. There are no atheists on the planet. Never have been, never will be. Sounds weird why would I say that? They know God exists because God has shown himself to them. He said it's more than obvious. They are without excuse. I've given them the knowledge of myself. But some of them have chosen to reject this knowledge, and those are the people who call themselves atheists. So yes, there are atheists on the planet. Always have been, always will be. But they're not people who don't know God exists. They're people who have chosen to reject that knowledge. So it's not our job to run around trying to prove God's existence. God says they already know I exist. Don't waste your time with that. It's a spiritual issue. They need to see the effect of Jesus Christ in your life to have any influence. It's not about winning an argument, talking about DNA. They say, oh, I don't know that about DNA. Can I come to church and worship Jesus with you? It doesn't work that way. They may come to you more mad because they can't necessarily answer that argument. So it's an emotional thing for them. So a lot of these people, I think, reject evolution because they know God exists. God has planted the truth in their heart. And if they haven't totally squashed that truth, they just know that there's got to be a God, there's got to be more to life than just accidental occurrences and you die and that's it. So I think that's why many people reject evolution. And that makes a lot of evolutionists mad. And what can we do more to teach this so that more people believe it? So I think there is a high percentage of people believe it because it just seems obvious. When you look around, it just doesn't seem like an accident. You can make up stories about how nothing created everything, and that nothing exploded into the universe, and then it formed a cell which turned into a human being, which can now think rationally about everything else. If our lives are truly an accident, accidental Big Bang forms our universe, by accident processes form a living cell, that living cell changes, that means our brains evolve by random processes. That means our thoughts are the result of random processes. So how can our thoughts be trusted to explain the origin of the universe and everything else if everything's random like that in accident? Versus God creating us in his image, and he gives us a mind where we can think his thoughts after him, and we can kind of understand our surroundings and see evidence of his existence. So it's ultimately a spiritual issue and not an academic debate. debate. But I appreciate you guys putting up with me talking 20 miles an hour. I will be at the table afterwards if you have additional questions.